Hey, welcome to podcast number 2 on Hearing the Sound, which is a podcast that it's exploring the intersection. I feel like I have to do that with my hands. The intersection between Jesus, faith, trauma-informed healing, cultures, people, relationships. That was a longer intersection than I hoped.
It's like a highway, many roads. You got to be careful where you're crossing on this intersection.
Should we do trauma recovery and Jesus?
Yeah.
That was really the short version.
Yeah, and we talked about last time Jesus is the model.
Yeah.
All trauma informed. And we said loads last time. So if you haven't yet watched episode 1, really encourage you to go back and listen to that. Because a lot of, I guess, the foundations for the conversation that we're just going to keep building on week to week. Yeah. Well, you'll be building on with different guests, and I'm here for the second time. Who knows?
You are. Son number 1, Josh.
I am son number 1.
Associate pastor.
Yeah.
Of Sound Church.
Yeah.
Which I started 25 years ago.
Yes.
And here I still am.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, grew up in Sound Church. Absolutely love the church. God called me back. Had no idea why or how. I never planned to be back. And he brought me back. And you always famously remind me when I was 7 years old. Apparently I said something shocking to you.
You did. I'm sorry that I keep going on about it. It just made me laugh, probably ever since that day. You were 7 and you were quite intense for a 7-year-old about your faith in Jesus. You really did really love him and really cared deeply about reading your Bible. I don't think it's because I paid you £10 to read your children's Bible when you were 6, but hey, it could have been.
I think it was 5.
Was it 5?
I think it was £5. It was the the kids Bible. The kids Bible for children, obviously. Yeah. And it was amazing. I loved it. Yeah. I didn't do it for the £5.
No.
Maybe part of me did.
Yeah, maybe. I think it went up to 10 by the time your youngest brother did that.
Blessings.
But that's 10 years difference, right?
Yeah.
So
inflation's a real thing as well.
Yeah, but what you said to me in that moment when you were 7, you were in the hall. We met in a school at first, and you looked at me very seriously and said, "When are you going to die, Mum?" And I said, "Why?" Because you didn't look worried. You just went, "When are you going to die?" Because I really want to take over the church.
That is a wild thing to say to anyone.
It's so cute.
And I want to remind everyone listening or watching, I was 7 years old. 7 years old. I don't necessarily remember saying that. Can I imagine myself having said that? Yeah, I could have.
Yeah, you had a dream. You were on a mission. I wonder where you got that from.
Yeah, exactly. Where did I get that from?
I was exactly the same at that age. Exactly the same. I felt called to be a missionary. And it was when I was 11 that I felt Jesus tell me that it needed to be in England. And I cried.
Yeah.
I was in the toilets at school. And I was like, really?
You weren't born in England, though.
No.
That's probably helpful context.
Yeah, so I wasn't a big fan of being in England. I felt like my life had been trained to live in poverty and hardship and bring the good news of Jesus, because I believe Jesus is really good news, like really good news, way better than most people understand. Like there is no good news like him. He literally restores and heals and still does miracles even today. And even, he's just incredible to walk through your daily life knowing that Jesus is with you.
Yeah.
And know that he cares deeply and he speaks and he guides. So I wanted to be a missionary and tell people that had never had the opportunity of knowing Jesus in a nation that had never had a Bible. And I felt God very clearly say, I want you to be a missionary to England. Yeah, I was 11. I'm now 53.
Yeah, that's quite a thing to remember at 11 years old. And when you say like you want to be a missionary where there's poverty, you weren't saying there's no poverty in England. Like,
no.
You grew up in Burundi, right?
Yeah.
Or like you spent years, that's where you were born, and like your brother was born there, and I think other family, like your parents.
My dad, my grandmother.
So you're saying that from like generations of going to the far ends of the world.
Yeah.
I guess we ended last episode with a big question that I asked you, and we were out of time.
Mm-hmm.
What people at home?
I can't remember the question.
I can. People at home wouldn't have seen someone holding up a sign saying 2 minutes, like wrap up. And so that we stopped the conversation. But you said it was a great one to start back this week. And we were talking about how the subconscious draws and pulls you in ways that sometimes consciously you're not necessarily aware of. And we talked about how I was asking a bit more about that. You were talking about the VIP last time. like the vulnerable professional inner child, which is your model and your framework. Some of your books, you've talked about it, which are in front of you, these are books you've written, which is probably helpful to point out at some point in the podcast as well. They're just not just the ones your favorite ones, these are ones you've written. And we talked about, I asked you a question about when it comes to almost like being drawn to the familiar and almost like the strength of draw and like the pull that religion can have for people. Some people don't have great experience in their childhood of like church and faith and religion, and so it's easier for them to detach themselves from the structure or the institution of church and latch themselves onto Jesus. But that's not the same for everyone. And for those of us that actually had a great time in church as kids, we latch ourselves onto that and want to like replicate that. Actually, we can miss Jesus.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. How does that work? How do we break? How do we navigate the subconscious, even with the good things, and how much we're at risk of missing Jesus in those?
Well, I would argue that one of our jobs as humans is to kind of almost keep short accounts with ourselves, in the sense of when we go through life, and in current society, this is difficult because everything is on such fast speed. Again, I'm 53, so things have changed in my lifetime with social media and all the usual stuff. Things are fast. Everybody's fast. What we produce in a day is fast. So it makes it difficult. But ultimately, we need to process our days and how we reacted and how we felt. And some of those feelings that maybe naturally our society wants to make us avoid. And I often you'll hear me often talking about collusion with avoidance. Our society wants us to collude with that. It's like such a strong culture of, oh, don't feel that thing. Don't acknowledge that thing. Pretend that didn't happen. Denial is far safer, which leads to people kind of pushing down negative emotions, experiencing things where maybe they did feel terrified, powerless, and overwhelmed, which is my definition of trauma. And rather than them going, oh man, that wasn't okay, I don't know how I feel, that might take me a while, and maybe even writing in a journal, need to process this at some point, or writing on their phones or something. Instead, society kind of really encourages us, still with what we used to call the stiff upper lip, that just keep it inside yourself, don't express it, crack on with your life, just carry on. And people have almost, I would argue, particularly actually I've found in a church culture, there's almost that sense of, well, they're very mature because they're so regulated with their emotions.
Yeah, right.
They stay in that absolute still emotional, they're not too excited and they're not too miserable, they're just nothing. Whereas I look at that and think, well, that's not like Jesus. Jesus showed a range of emotions. And he processed with his disciples things that were going on. And that's what we're meant to do, which I would argue, I grew up with the concept of a quiet time every day, whether it's the morning or the evening. There's that time to draw aside to spend time with Jesus. And as you do that, if you can process some of your feelings with him, actually, even neuroscience tells us that that's a really positive thing. There's so much evidence now to that quiet reflection, meditation. Essentially, you are bringing up from the subconscious into the conscious. And if you do it regularly, then it doesn't go too deep. If it goes too deep, you end up often going into some level of denial and colluding with society's avoidance on big feelings, strong feelings, painful feelings. And so you don't know it's there. And then you get shocked by your reactions to something.
And I know, like the last episode, we talked about how when you get shocked by what you're drawn to, and like you're going, God, I don't know why. You talked about like the Father's embrace, like in holding you when you're like, I want that thing that I shouldn't want to want, but I do want, and how does that look in a church context? Like I know that doing a certain way of church, I feel so at home in, and I feel so safe with. I feel like, oh, maybe Jesus is there more than he is somewhere else, and I can miss Jesus in that.
Yeah.
Like that drive and pull, almost like to replicate something I had in childhood, rather than actually to meet with the King of Kings and the Creator of heavens and earth. Like, how do we do that journey when it's like, doesn't it feel safe, but we feel like God's there and we feel.
Yeah, there's so much I would like to say at that point. Number one, I'm not convinced we know what a church is meant to look like. I'm not convinced. I'm not saying I know either. I'm just not convinced that we've cracked that one. I feel like there's so much more to explore on what Jesus was talking about in gathering together. around his name. And historically, there's obviously been lots of disasters, and there's also been some beautiful pioneering concepts. But I just don't feel like we've really explored as much as we probably need to what that is. And I would say that maybe one of the reasons for that is that familiarity thing, that many people that grew up with a certain style or a certain feeling and vibe, that makes them feel familiar and comfortable. And so that can be positive. Absolutely. It can feel like a safe place emotionally. Or it can, again, actually cause avoidance, dissociation, absolute numb, because you just go through the motions. And so it isn't so much about Jesus. It's very much about a comforting, dulling almost sensation of, I've gone through that and I feel calmer now. Well, where was Jesus within that? And also, I'm often looking at gatherings of young people, of which we've obviously in our church, well, not obviously, we've got a lot of young people in our church, and I love that. And it's always been a priority for me to try, and not that you can really do it. You can't choose and go, I want young people, but you can try and resource it and pray them in. But I love lots of young people. But we know, don't we, that when you get a group of people that have a sense of connectivity together, then oxytocin is released, which just means that you feel this sense of, whoa, I'm okay, I'm loved, I belong, I'm happy. But you also get the dopamine release when they're all, dancing together in worship. There's that sense of, whoa, which even though it looks externally phenomenal, sometimes it can be that actually it's the hormone release rather than the presence of God. And how do we differentiate that? I'm not saying I'm an expert either, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen in my church. I'm not. I'm just going, oh, that's a whole thing that we need to be aware of and navigate. And I don't even know how we navigate, other than be aware of it and say, oh, are we definitely still, is Jesus definitely central? What if I think, recently, you're around me, like, I just stopped the music. I went, no, let's stop it. And the drums were cool. I went, let's just not have the drums, because I was worried we were going a bit too happy almost. It was almost hype. I don't know. It was just a bit exciting. I was like, oh, come on. I think somewhere in the midst of this, we just need to come back to the basics of church is about Jesus, and Jesus is really good news. And I would argue, as a trauma psychotherapist, which of course I don't say in my other world. I have two worlds. My other world is where I'm a trauma psychotherapist, and ethically I can't talk about Jesus in that world. That's not for me to do. I can live in a way that I hope people maybe might ask questions, why I'm so hope-filled. And then I have my other world, which is the church world, where I overtly talk about Jesus a lot, and I don't feel that's lacking in integrity. I feel like that's a thing that I'm meant to do for now. I was going to say something, but I've lost it.
Well, I've got quite a few questions on that. Like, I'd love to ask you about dissociation in a church service. Like, what does that look like? That's quite scary. Like, if we don't know, I don't know loads about dissociation. I've done some of your training on it, but like almost a tendency to do that. I'd love to ask you about that. Also, have to ask you about the Esther stuff. And like, when you were just saying how like having two worlds is not like you're not living two lives. No. There's like almost two spheres of influence, and like that's not a lack of integrity. No. Like, I don't know that many people that I talk to, and they have to have two worlds because God asked them to, or because God did. Like, how have you navigated that, having two worlds?
It was a shock at first, but I've navigated it because, sadly, I work with survivors of trauma, and I teach on trauma in many different places. And the reality, sadly, and it is gutting, is that many people have actually experienced religious trauma, church trauma connected to religious experiences. And so if I just stand there and go, I'm a trauma psychotherapist, author of books on trauma, and I pastor a church, that can be literally frightening for people, literally frightening, and it stops them learning. And I'd rather they learnt about trauma, and then if they find out, like you might find out today, people, if you then find out I'm also a pastor of a church that I started that doesn't necessarily look like other churches, because I wanted to take it from the Bible, what a church could look like, and be about Jesus and not be about religion and the way that I'm told it should be, because I wanted to go back to the Bible and work that out with a group of people. Hopefully they're less scared. Hopefully they trust me enough that they've seen my life and they've seen me being entirely authentic, and And so I'm hopeful they would think that it would be not possible for me to hurt people intentionally. And if I ever hurt people unintentionally, I'd be authentically gutted and say sorry. So that's kind of my two different worlds, I guess. It's if I was a teacher, it wouldn't be such an issue. I'd go, yeah, I go to church, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I still wouldn't share too much because you can't in that context either. But as a trauma psychotherapist, I have to be particularly careful, unless people say, I have a faith in Jesus. Could we include that in the work that we're doing? In which case, absolutely, of course we can. I'd be delighted in it.
Yeah, and I guess that when you talk about an Esther mission, you're talking about the book of Esther in the Bible, and a lady that represented and did actually massive things, like took a risk to save a lot of people, like that's cool. And the work you're doing, even though you can't talk about Jesus, you're doing it because it's something God asked you to do.
But I think more than that, I think it's bringing in his kingdom culture. The kingdom of God is he's the king, and his culture is one of the fruits of the Spirit. So it's entirely about love and faithfulness and kindness and compassion. And it's what I'm teaching, a trauma-informed culture, I would argue is a kingdom culture, unless it's just you're skirting a little bit on the surface and you're just recognising that some people are troubled, as people might call it. And that's not trauma-informed.
Right.
No, I don't think that's trauma-informed. If you've done a half-a-day training in trauma, that's not trauma-informed. That's skirting on the surface. But if you've done a proper longer term training and you've wrestled with the impact of trauma on lives of different ages and how that could impact learning and behavior and relationships and emotions and memory and all of those different areas, in that case, that's understanding how Jesus views humankind who arguably are hurting. And one of the names for God is he's the healer. So being a healer, that's God wants his healing released on the earth, because he loves his people, all humans he loves. They're made in his image, every person made in his image. So I believe that I can train anybody, anyone that's got breath in their lungs. Could we facilitate healing? That's my passion, actually. So yeah, I love churches being trauma-informed and churches being emotionally safe places and churches being able to facilitate healing for those that have been hurt. 100%. I love that. But I equally love training people in whatever sphere they're in, whatever country they're in, how they can be trained and equipped and understand some of it's quite basic, how we can actually be humans that change culture where we go, to be human-centered enough to, human-centered, I don't mean selfish, I mean an understanding of the complexity of humanity, so that rather than people going straight into shame and self-rejection and self-hatred and accepting their symptoms will be with them for life, instead I'm training people to go, no, there's hope for recovery, there's hope for healing, there's hope for people's dreams to happen, the stuff that's right in them. Like when you were 7, you wanted to lead churches, that thing, even if you'd gone off and done a million other things, I believe at some point that would have come back, because that's your inner God-given dream, actually. And I believe everyone's got one. Everyone's got one, but it can get lost in the mess of life.
And because you talk a lot about trauma-informed and trauma recovery processes.
Yeah.
Like in a world that's talking way more about trauma, and I guess lots of people are giving different definitions, like what trauma recovery looks like or what trauma-informed practice looks like. And for those people who don't necessarily know what that would look like physically or in their context, and they might be thinking it just means that they sit down and they're overwhelmed by how much is going on in the world, because it's overwhelming, right? Mm-hmm. There is so much pain, there is so much hurt. Now, what does that actually look like to respond in a trauma-informed world to a world full of hurt, which could otherwise be overwhelming? Like where do you think the misconceptions are, or what people see a trauma-informed church should be? Where have you seen it go well? Talk about that.
I think you've just asked about 10 questions.
I do apologise.
Which is brilliant. I reckon that's about 5 books. I think what I'll answer is, where has a trauma-informed culture gone wrong, and what can we do just really quickly on how to create one. Does that work?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think where it goes wrong with a trauma-informed culture is when we end up kind of almost excusing everyone's behavior because, like, well, they didn't mean to just punch that child's eyes out. They didn't mean to steal from the cafe. They didn't mean to, trip over 5 people. They're traumatized. That's not how it works. Trauma symptoms, we recognize where they come from, but we're working with humans to recognize, acknowledge, and then help them have ways of expressing their pain in different ways that don't hurt other people. And helping them feel emotionally safe, that they're less likely to hurt another person because they don't have to defend themselves.
But isn't that like that? That's like such a thing. I don't know. You could write 5 books. I'm jumping in straight away. Like almost like before doing some of your training and reading your books, is almost like the nervousness. Like if I didn't respond to that outburst of the stealing in the cafe or the punching in the eye, like almost like really strongly, then almost like I wasn't like bleeding injustice.
Yeah, which is a point. But when somebody, I believe ultimately nobody wants to be bad and no one wants to be naughty. I fully believe that. I really believe that with everything. I don't believe anyone wants to be that person. So when they're doing things that are bad, they're not a bad person because they're made in the image of God. So those are symptoms of distress. I'm not in any way minimalizing those symptoms of distress if they hurt another. I'm not at all. But I'm recognizing for the person to stop hurting others, they actually need somebody to relationally build emotional connection with them enough in a way that Jesus showed. Jesus was, he's still in today's culture. I don't know if the word radical works anymore, but he was revolutionary in the way that he loved people that were seen as unlovable, that were seen as rejected, that were seen as outcasts. He was there doing things that were, people's breath were taken away. And in the same way, when people that we think are incredibly bad people, when we understand, I believe, how Jesus says that, everyone's made in the image of God, then there aren't bad people. So they're symptoms of distress. Let's build a relationship with them. Hold the boundaries of what you did there wasn't acceptable. I don't agree with what you did. You should never do that again. I never want you to do that again. Never hit that person again. Never shout or swear in their face. Don't do that again. That's not okay. But I want to get to know you better. I want to get to know, I'm wondering where that came from. I'm wondering how we can help you feel safer in this church so you don't feel suddenly so frightened that you shout at someone in their face or you swear at them or you run out or you punch somebody. How can we create emotional safety for you?
Yeah.
That's it. Ultimately, it comes from this core belief: God doesn't make mistakes. There's nobody that's not made in his image. Well, in that case, it's our job as humans to try and find out who they are. Who does God say that they are? And how can we help them see that? So I would argue one of the first things to facilitate recovery or hope is the neurobiology. It's the understanding of, if this happens to you, you might respond like this, or you might respond as more thoughtful, or you might react from a subconscious place like that. That doesn't mean you are that person. It means that you did that, but you can learn to acknowledge it, accept it, say sorry for it. And in the Jesus context, you can say, Jesus, help me never do that again. Please, Jesus, help me never do that again. I never, ever want to do that again. Help me become more how you created me to be. Whereas in my other world, I can't add that bit on, which is very powerful. I just have to say, you acknowledge, you accept you did it, you don't go into denial, and you think, I don't want to do that again. I want to become the person that I'm meant to be. But in the Jesus world, we can say, Jesus, help us. And we know that that's not a prayer to Father Christmas. That's a prayer to the living God who has the Holy Spirit to empower us to change and transform from the heart.
From the heart, right. Yeah. That's revolutionary. Like there's actually hope for people when they recognize, I don't want to be doing that, but I find myself doing that, and how the church can respond. Yeah. So to not help them just to stop doing it, but their desire still be rooted in their heart, but actually to deal from the heart. Yeah. How can you talk a bit more about that? Like how sometimes I think it's so easy just to go look at the symptoms and to miss the heart entirely. And like when you talked in the last episode about that integration between the head and the head and the heart, or the conscious subconscious.
Yeah.
It's hard. How do you pastor in that context of helping people from the heart rather than just from the head?
Yeah, I think I often talk about if I make mistakes, I say to people, if I've hurt you, can you know that my intention was never to hurt you? Because I find it hard if you think I intentionally hurt you, because I promise you I've never intentionally hurt somebody. And intention is very different to hurting. If I've hurt you, I am gutted. But if you think I intentionally hurt you, I'm beyond gutted, because I'm not that person. And I think there's something about that when we understand that most people hurt others and do things that aren't okay, not because they intentionally did it, but because they got trapped in ways of coping that weren't functional, they were dysfunctional. When we can acknowledge that without shame, it changes people's lives, because they're like, what, you mean I'm not bad? I'm not rejected by God. I'm not rejected by you. You're not giving up on me. I'm not giving up on anyone, because Jesus didn't. So I fully believe in transformation of the most complex person with the most complex history, because I also believe that Jesus does miracles today too, which I know might blow some people's mind, but I really do. He does, because he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I'm not excusing behaviour. Please hear me now. If somebody barges into church, and does something horrific, I'm not excusing that at all. That's not okay. And God is also a God of justice. That's the very on the footstool of his throne. Like, justice is important. Justice is vital. We're not excusing it. We're not saying it's okay, but we're saying there's hope for recovery if we recognise why you did that. Because once you acknowledge why, and you can invite Jesus into that, and you begin to acknowledge where that first came from. Let's say you've got an anger problem. I've been around too many people that go, stop it. Stop being angry. I'm like, you're looking angry while you're telling someone to stop being angry. Like, that's not going to work. Instead, why are you angry? Is there injustice that no one defended you over? Is there hurt that, anger we often call is the guard dog to sadness. Are you actually just sad and it's coming out as anger because it feels less vulnerable? Are you angry with everyone around you because actually you are just plain miserable? In which case, I wonder whether we can do something practical. I wonder whether we can help you know Jesus as the healer. I wonder whether you understand yourself. I wonder if you've rejected yourself and now you hate yourself and you're stuck in this cycle of hating yourself and you see yourself as an angry person. Whereas I'd be like, oh, you're not an angry person. You need to express anger for injustice that's happened and it's never been validated. So why don't you express that with me? In fact, I'll join you. That thing that happened to you as a child, I'm gutted that happened to you as well. I'm angry with you. I'll be angry with you. I'm not going to hurt anyone here, but I'm angry with you. And as we're angry together, we can release it. And actually the likelihood of that person being angry with everyone will be already beginning to change.
Wow. So if someone's listening and they're going like, I feel that anger. I've only ever been told to stop being angry.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what you just said there about anger being the guard dog to sadness.
Yeah.
I mean, you put it a slightly different way. You said that anger is often the face or the mask of sadness. I remember that hit me, and I was like, that makes so much more sense. Yeah. Yeah. I remember getting quite emotional about that. Yeah. I can see some elements of my life where I've responded quite angry, but I'm just quite sad about something.
Yeah.
And that acknowledgement that goes fast. So like, if someone's watching this and they're going, I don't like the symptoms of what's in my life. How do I bring that to Jesus? Like, how do I respond? And you've touched on quite a lot there, but to thread it all together.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Roughly speaking, I think acknowledgement is the starting point. Just acknowledge it and know that I've written a whole book on shame, but in brief, guilt is helpful. If any of us have done something to hurt another, we should feel guilty, but then we take our guilt to the person and we say, sorry, I'm sorry I hurt you. I really didn't mean to, but I'm sorry I hurt you. And we take it to Jesus and say, will you forgive me? And that's really cleansing. But when we feel shame, it's not I did something wrong. Shame is the feeling of I'm wrong. I'm a bad person. And Jesus doesn't like that shame because he came to reduce shame, to kill off shame, because shame is disconnecting to us and God and us and humans. So we need to recognize, first of all, acknowledge what has happened to us, or acknowledge how we're reacting to people, or what our symptoms are that might be harmful to others or ourselves, or just frustrating because we feel like there's a ceiling over our life. Acknowledge. Then make sure that we don't let shame get in and make us feel like we're a reject, we're bad, we're useless. Reduce shame. Remember, Jesus came to forgive and to cleanse and to restore. And then say, Jesus, will you start to heal me? Will you start to heal me of what happened to me as I acknowledge what happened to me? Will you help me begin to have enough capacity to acknowledge what's happened to me? And if it's a big, big thing, it's very gradual, little bit at a time, little bit at a time. You can't acknowledge the whole thing at once. It's too destabilizing. Little bit at a time. And as you acknowledge a little bit of a time, you just invite Jesus into that, and he begins to heal. Which sounds random. If you're not a follower of Jesus here, you'll be like, you what? Is that like a fairy? Because it does sound weird. But the reality is, it says very clearly that God is three. He's Trinity. God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is here with us. And so he ministers to us. He heals our hearts. He heals and puts together the brokenhearted, which is what I'm passionate about seeing. And I've seen literally thousands of people experiencing the healing power of God, change and transform stories of utter pain and agony into stories where they can own it, acknowledge it, and say, but Jesus, look what he did for me.
Love that.
I love it too.
I think we're out of time. We've had the 2-minute sign flying up.
Yeah, it's great. Well, thank you for joining us. I feel like we're just beginning again. Maybe we need to do more than half an hour. Maybe it needs to be a bit longer. Who knows? We're learning, but it's great that you joined us. Thanks. See you again. Bye. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Betsy. Thanks for having me on.